Most histories of the Second World War describe winter as a military problem. Frozen engines, stalled offensives, and armies trapped in icebound landscapes. But, winter was far more relentless in civilian life. Behind the front lines, in bombed cities, occupied villages, and besieged industrial centers, families faced something more persistent than battlefield cold. They faced months, sometimes even years, without reliable fuel, insulation, or infrastructure. Survival depended not on rescue, but on adaptation. What kept millions alive was not technology in the modern sense. It was method, carefully developed, repeatedly tested, and quietly passed from household to household. Entire domestic routines were reorganized around heat preservation, fuel efficiency, and body temperature management. Many of these systems were never formally documented, yet they influenced post-war survival doctrine and civil defense planning across much of the 20th century. If you value history that examines how people actually endured war, not just how armies fought it, subscribe to the survival record, because the survival knowledge civilians developed in winter scarcity remains relevant anywhere cold and uncertainty intersect. Homes were no longer heated. They were strategically insulated. Fuel shortages forced a fundamental shift in how families thought about shelter. Instead of heating entire buildings, civilians concentrated on preventing heat loss. Interior walls were layered with rugs, blankets, and salvaged upholstery. Doorways were sealed with fabric, straw, or paper. Windows were covered not simply to block drafts, but to trap radiated warmth. This transformation was especially visible in besieged cities such as Leningrad, where heating systems failed and fuel deliveries collapsed. Families quickly discovered that generating heat mattered less than preserving what little existed. Rooms were isolated from one another. Unused spaces were allowed to freeze if necessary. The home became a thermal system, not a living space in the pre-war sense. Modern emergency shelter design, especially the concept of creating insulated microclimates inside larger structures, reflects this civilian discovery. In extreme scarcity, containment is more reliable than production. Heat was treated as something to store, not something to constantly produce. Where fuel was available at all, it was burned intensely but briefly. The goal was not continuous warmth, but stored warmth. Heavy masonry stoves, already common in parts of Eastern and Northern Europe, became central survival tools. Thick ceramic or stone structures absorbed heat during short, high-temperature burns and released it gradually over many hours. Daily routines formed around this heat release cycle. Cooking, drying clothing, and sleep were scheduled to coincide with peak thermal output. Fire became an event rather than a background necessity. This approach shaped heating practices long after the war, particularly in the Soviet Union, where thermal mass heating was increasingly viewed as a resilience strategy. The lesson was simple but enduring. When fuel supply is uncertain, stored heat is more dependable than sustained combustion. Sleeping arrangements were reorganized to conserve body heat collectively. Privacy became secondary to thermal survival. Families slept in close clusters, often in the smallest insulated room available. Basements and cellars were common choices because underground temperatures fluctuated less dramatically than surface air. Shared bedding reduced exposed surface area and stabilized warmth through combined body heat. Children were placed centrally, surrounded by adults who functioned as thermal buffers. Blankets were layered densely, sometimes combined with clothing that remained worn during sleep. This was not merely cultural closeness, it was efficient heat retention. The principle later became standard guidance in extreme cold survival training. Group warmth conserves energy more effectively than isolated protection. Clothing evolved into a moisture management system rather than a fashion or uniform. Cold exposure alone is rarely the primary threat. Moisture is. Damp fabric drains heat rapidly, and frozen moisture intensifies heat loss even further. Wartime civilians learned to manage this relentlessly. Foot wraps replaced socks in many regions because they could be adjusted throughout the day and dried quickly. Clothing was worn in multiple thin layers to allow vapor to escape rather than condense. Materials like newspaper, cardboard, and scrap wool were inserted between layers as temporary insulation. Garments were patched repeatedly rather than replaced. Drying routines became structured parts of daily life. Even limited warmth was directed first toward removing moisture from clothing, not simply warming bodies. These practices anticipated modern cold weather doctrine, which emphasizes vapor management, modular layering, and constant moisture control. Civilian experience preceded formal military standardization. Households became small-scale fuel laboratories. When coal and firewood disappeared, families manufactured fuel from whatever remained available. Sawdust was compressed into bricks, peat was dried and rationed carefully. Paper waste was tightly rolled to prolong burn time. Even broken furniture was dismantled and processed for controlled combustion rather than burned indiscriminately. The key objective was predictability. Families needed materials that burned at known rates so heat release cycles could be planned precisely. Random burning wasted energy, controlled burning preserved it. Improvised biomass compression techniques later appeared in post-war research on emergency fuels. Methods developed out of desperation became recognized as efficient resource conversion systems. Water management became a thermal survival problem. Frozen pipes and inaccessible wells forced families to store water indoors, but melting snow or ice required precious heat energy. Households learned to melt water only during peak heating periods and store it in insulated containers for later use. Humidity control also became essential. Excess moisture condensed on walls and windows, accelerating heat loss and promoting freezing surfaces inside living areas. Ventilation was managed carefully, enough to reduce condensation, but not enough to waste warmth. Families learned to think in terms of phase changes. Melting, evaporation, and condensation all involved energy transfer. Understanding this became essential to preserving heat. Food timing was structured around heat production inside the body. Metabolism generates warmth, and wartime households learned to use this deliberately. The largest meal often came just before sleep, ensuring the body produced maximum internal heat during the coldest part of the night. High-fat foods were prioritized when available because they released energy more slowly and sustained heat production longer. Even severe rationing did not eliminate strategic meal timing. Calories were treated as thermal fuel, not simply nutrition. This pattern later influenced extreme environment expedition planning, where metabolic heat management became an established survival strategy. Movement inside the home was carefully restricted to preserve temperature zones. Families designated specific heated areas and sealed them from the rest of the building. Movement between zones was minimized. Doors remained closed. Chores were scheduled to avoid unnecessary transitions between warm and cold spaces. Children were taught not to wander freely between rooms. Even routine household activity was evaluated for its thermal cost. The idea of a uniformly heated home disappeared. Instead, warmth existed only where it could be defended. Modern, energy-efficient architecture, with controlled climate zones and sealed thermal boundaries, reflects this same principle, though wartime civilians practiced it out of necessity rather than design. Windows were converted into layered insulation barriers. Glass conducts heat rapidly, making windows one of the greatest sources of heat loss. Families added interior coverings, waxed paper, oiled cloth, salvaged plastic, layered parchment, to trap insulating air between surfaces. In some cases, frost buildup was left undisturbed because ice itself functioned as insulation. The goal was not visibility but thermal stability. The same principle now defines double-pane window design. Trapped air reduces heat transfer. Wartime households implemented this solution with whatever materials they could find. Children were trained to understand heat as a limited resource. Perhaps the most overlooked adaptation was behavioral. Children learned early that warmth was finite. They were taught how to sit, sleep, dress, and move in ways that preserved heat. Awareness of drafts, dampness, and exposure became part of daily upbringing. Thermal discipline was not optional knowledge. It was survival knowledge. Entire generations grew up understanding heat as something fragile and easily lost. This behavioral transmission helped populations endure prolonged winters under occupation, siege, and displacement. Survival depended not only on material adaptation, but on learned restraint. Winter did not simply challenge wartime civilians. It forced them to redesign domestic life around energy flow, insulation, and biological heat production. These were not temporary improvisations. They were structured systems developed under sustained scarcity, systems that influenced later survival training, emergency planning, and cold weather design. Remembering these practices matters because they reveal a form of resilience rarely captured in conventional war narratives. Battles shape borders, but survival knowledge shapes whether populations endure long enough to see peace return. If you value understanding the practical history of human endurance, the knowledge that preserved life when infrastructure collapsed, subscribe to the Survival Record and share this video with others who believe history matters most when we understand how people actually survived it.